Hello and welcome to this video tutorial in which we will build this goods shed. The shed will be modeled in wood, painted with acrylic paints and put into a diorama of a disused siding. Let's not talk more and get started. For this type of project, I always start by making a drawing. From the drawing I make a paper or styrofoam mock-up to check what size fits in the diorama. I increase or decrease the size until I think it fits with the perspective. Once happy, I take measurements of the mock-up and build according to those. However, in this case it's a goods shed and it will always stand next to HO scale models, so I will build it to scale. The shed will be modeled from pre-engraved sheets of wood. I picked these ones up at my local hobby store and they're manufactured by Northeastern Scale Lumber. I cut the four sides of the shed using a razor blade and a steel scale. I'm waiting to make the cutouts for the windows until I made the windows, since the windows are made from scrap. These are scrap from, I think it was a round house I built previously. So I'm marking the position where I will cut, and then I cut the framework, the wooden framework of the windows out from these windows. Hey, there are also sets available in your hobby store with just windows, so if you don't have any scraps you can always purchase one of those sets. Then I glue with fast set glue. This is transparent plastic from some, I think this one was from a set of screwdrivers. Trim away excess plastic and then sand the edges of the windows so the transparent plastic and the woodwork has exactly the same dimension. That will vastly simplify assembly later. The door is cut out from flat style panel. Next action is to make the same cutout in the walls of the shed. I'm making most of the cutout from the front to match the panel spacing, and then I make the last cutting from the rear side. Alright. The idea now is to, if necessary, sand so I get the perfect fit to the door. I repeat the process for the windows. The top of the window should be aligned with the top of the door. The pair of windows located on the top side of the short end of this shed needs to be glued together. I'm gluing them together using a spacer in between, which is made from strip styrene. That strip styrene needs to be painted ahead of assembly, and I do that using burnt umber. Let that paint dry, cut it to length, and glue it in place using fast set glue. First on the one of the windows and then glue the other window to that one. Once assembled, measurements can be taken and the cutout in the wall can be made accordingly. Next is to sand the wall edges to 45 degrees ahead of painting them. I use a hard board with a perfect 19-degree edge in order to succeed with this work. I align the two sides of the wall to the board sides. Try to prioritize the perfection in the movement rather than putting too much force on the sanding block. Once all sides are sanded to 45 degrees, you should have an almost perfect fit. I now also cut out the loading bridges. Once cut out, I also engrave the end pattern of the planks, because this will be highly visible in the final result. The cargo doors will be painted with a slightly thinned black acrylic paint. The thinner I'm using is a mix between water and isopropanol. This thinned paint will also let us see the wood texture through the paint and gives a good foundation for later weathering. Okay, with both of the doors painted, I thinned that paint with twice as much thinner as I had initially. So this is more of a wash really, and I apply that onto the walls. The idea with this wash is to enhance the contrast in the wood texture, so it will be better visible through the top layer of paint, which will be a brown red type paint. The brownish red is mixed from burnt umber and cavalry brown. This paint mix is also thinned using water and isopropanol. I use this paint mix to paint all of the walls one layer, and then I add another layer just below the roof, since the paint is typically better preserved being protected by the roof. Now leave this to dry properly and let's instead get started on the floor. It's a wooden floor inside the goods shed. I measured the actual floor size from the walls, and based on that I cut out the floor from the panel. I will weather the floor ahead of assembly using these patina markers. This type of wooden panel though is very absorbent to color, so I'm spraying it ahead of weathering using isopropanol water mix. I'm wiping off the excess thinner and then applying number 51, which is a grey-brown color. It's called latte. Edges and contours can be faded using the blender. Leave that to dry now and let's focus on the floor beams. They are cut from 1.5mm thick balsa sheet and I slice them in 3mm width. Cut several times before cutting through to avoid cracking. The floor beams will be placed with 20mm spacing. The beams are then glued in place using wood glue or white glue. Excess glue is removed using a piece of scrap wood. Put some weight on top of this and leave it to dry for an hour. Meanwhile, I'm starting the assembly of windows and doors into the walls. The window is assembled slightly recessed into the wall. The door should be a sliding door in real life, so it should be even more recessed. Once you feel happy, fix everything from the rear side using fast set glue. With the doors and windows in place, we can start the assembly of the goods shed. I start by gluing the floor to one long side of the shed and then continuing wall by wall until I have completed the assembly. We also now need to add the beams under the loading bridges. Those are also made from 1.5 balsa sheet, which is cut in 3mm width. Glue them in place using wood glue. Once dry, paint that black as well. I've previously painted the trim panels black as well. I'm fixing them in place using wood glue. Trim ends to angle using a sanding block. Time to glue the visible part of the window sashes in place. And those will be made from strip styrene. I'm using 2 steel scale, which I clamped to the table as a cutting fixture to get the same length of all cut pieces. They are glued in place using fast set glue. I put a drop of fast set glue on a suitable surface next to it and then I dip them into that glue and place them on the wall. The loading bridge is glued in place using white glue or wood glue. These goods sheds had all tiled roof. For this purpose I bought a plastic sheet with tiled roof. Now I don't think it's so easy to work with this plastic sheet because it's too thick and very hard. So I instead make a mold I'm applying PVA glue, which is wood glue, white glue, on top of this and let it dry. The base in the roof will be this balsa sheet. The stairs on both sides is made from northeastern scale lumber 2 by 8 inches, which I painted black previously. Assembly is made using fast set glue. I use a tweezer to fix the steps in place, and then I dip all of the steps at once into the pool of fast set glue and then glue on the last part. Once I'm happy with the alignment of all the steps, I glue it in place on the goods shed using fast set glue. One nice detail is a 50s style lamp over the loading dock. Here's a casted lamp house. I picked this one up at 187.se. The lamp housing is fitted to a 0.7mm brass tubing. I'm first trimming away some of the mold burr on the casting. After that I'm sanding the brass tubing to get it a bit conical and get it easier to insert into the molded lamp house. I cut it to length using a razor blade and then make it inside conical to simplify insertion of the copper wires going to the SMD LED. With the copper wires in place, I paint the inside of the lamp house white. This is both to give it a white paint, but also to give some electrical isolation. The round light diffuser is cut from 3mm diameter plastic tubing. Then insert the copper wires through the brass tubing and fix the brass tubing to the lamp house using a drop of fast set glue. The LED and the light diffuser is also fixed using fast set glue. I now test the armature so I'm sure that it works. Now cut away the mold lid and grind smooth. Bend the mast over a slightly rounded surface, try it in place, make a hole for the wires, and then paint the armature to your liking. I've selected a natural grey color for further weathering later. Assembly is used by a quarter drop of fast set glue. And then once more check that the lamp actually is working. Okay, now that roof mold has dried, so we're peeling that off from the plastic plate. The edge can be peeled off using a scalpel and then just pull it off. I'm fixing it to the carriers, the 1.5mm balsa, using wood glue or white glue. Same glue as I used to mold it. Just press it in place there and it will stick beautifully to the balsa. The 1.5mm balsa sheet is too thick to look good at the roof edge, so I'm sanding that thin using a sanding block. This type of shed rests on concrete pillars. The concrete pillars will be made from a strip of styrofoam, which I've cut with a scalpel. I paint the entire strip with acrylic grey paint. This grey blend contains from white, black and a tiny amount of yellow. The purpose with the yellow portion is to avoid it looking blue. Once the grey acrylic paint has dried, I glue them in place, using the same spacing as the floor beams. Then glue the grey pieces of panels in between the concrete pillars. The last part of the assembly is the roof. We're gluing it in place and aligning it carefully onto the walls. Now leave everything to dry for an hour. This type of tiled roof is typically orange colored. I'm mixing orange with a tiny amount of both brown and white. Once the orange paint has dried, we can glue the panel pieces in place on each roof edge. I've previously painted these in this diluted or thinned black acrylic paint as well. And now we can paint it in the matching brown color as the rest of the shed. Hey, this is a a genuine 70s style paint scheme, orange and brown. Every door needs a handle, so does our sliding door. I intend to do one here as well. I do this from a 0.3 millimeter piano wire, which I'm folding into a square like this. Cut it, dip the edges into facet glue, and then just press it into the wood and it will stay there. Let's now get started on the weathering. I'm starting off with the roof, applying number 60 warm gray in streaks, primarily on the concave part of the tiles, and then use the blender to fade edges. I also use the blender pen to fade and partly remove the brown paint and gradually towards the bottom, replacing it by adding from the gray pen. If you like a heavier weathering, you can dry brush on a grayish light brown paint. Worn areas is wiped using a cotton swab or cotton pin. That way the red-brown color is wiped off and the wood gets exposed. As I mentioned in the intro, this wooden shed will be implemented onto an existing diorama. The diorama is really so far just a ballasted piece of track with surrounding grass. As you see here, the goods shed is too low, so when I'm trying with a car, it's lacking about 10 millimeters in height. So we need to add a layer of 10 millimeter plaster. I'm marking the area where I will fill with plaster. For this purpose I use a concrete-based plaster. The advantage with this one is that it doesn't crack and it doesn't shrink. I'm mixing 4 parts powder and 1 part water. I'm applying the plaster to the diorama using a wooden stick, but then I use a steel plaster to get some finish on it. I want it to be as flat as possible, so I avoid too much sanding. Now the result won't be all that perfect after this first layer of plaster, so we need to put another layer of plaster. This time I'm using a standard sand-based plaster for indoor wall plastering. I prepared a piece of paper which has the same dimension as the goods shed, so I'm putting that into the position where I want my goods shed, and then I'm adding grass glue along the edges of this plastered area. I'm also applying some glue in the middle of the road. Next step is to sprinkle sand, fine sand, into the wet glue. This sand will give us a coarse texture to the edges of the road as well as to the center. Now mask the surrounding areas and cover this with a rather thick layer of flat gray spray paint. This layer of wet spray paint will also act as an adhesive for the grout we're going to sprinkle over. This is a mix of brown and gray grout, which I sprinkle through a nylon sock to get the maximum diffusion. Sprinkling this grout over the entire surface. The edges and the lower areas next to the roadbed is wetted with a dark brown wash. The wash adds contrast and highlights the coarse particle in the gravel. First layer of static grass is a 2.5 millimeter meadow grass. I apply it quite richly into the glued areas. The second layer of static grass is just turfs. Turfs of 6 millimeter beige or golden yellow grass. We're finalizing the surrounding areas by adding pieces of foliage to simulate bushes. Once done, I'm just making a hole to have a lead through for the wires coming from the lamp in the goods shed, and I feed them through like this and glue the shed in place. A wooden plank, a barrel of oil and some figures completes the scene.
Alright, I hope you liked the tutorial. If you did, please help others to find this video by giving it a thumbs up. If you got questions, please post them in the comment field below and I'll try to answer them as soon as possible. If these videos helped you with your hobby, remember that all of this happens because a few of you supports the channel. So if you want to be one of the good guys and keep the lights on here and the cameras rolling, sharing my passion with you, go on to Patreon or make a one-off donation via PayPal on the link found below in the video description. Please subscribe to the channel and you will get a notification once next video gets published. Until that happens, see ya!